For those of you who have just joined, thank you so much for joining. I'm Alex Slosby, Chief Growth Officer here with InnoLead. Excited to welcome you to our webcast, 3 Things Corporations Can Do to Win with AI in 2024, with my friend Elliott Parker, CEO of High Alpha Innovation. We're going to get started in a minute and are excited for this very sort of interactive session. We've got some sort of good insights and ideas that Elliott's going to take us through. We're going to discuss a bunch of the points, but really want to ensure that you all take the time to put thoughts and questions into the chat and the Q&A. So we're taking it all as we go and at the end. We are recording the webcast as we do. We'll share both the replay and the slides after the fact, so you'll get that. And again, as I said, we'll address your questions and comments as we go and also at the end. So let's get started. I'll begin by introducing Elliott. Again, Elliott is CEO of High Alpha Innovation, a venture building firm whose mission is to help the world's leading organizations innovate through systematic startup creation. Prior to his current role, Elliott led business design at High Alpha, the Indianapolis-based venture studio. He's also worked in strategy consulting at Innosight in corporate venturing, and is an entrepreneur to bring new ideas to market. So Elliott, good to have you here. I look forward to our discussion. Why don't you kick us off?
Thanks. Good to see everybody. And Alex, thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here. We've got a kind of a lofty title today, How to Win with Generative AI in 2024. We're going to keep this pretty informal today and welcome your questions and comments in the chat. We're all learning about this together. It's early days for generative AI. We'll talk a little bit about some of the background and where we're at, but we're all learning about this together. And I hope that you're all providing good questions and comments along the way. Let me share my screen here. We're going to be jumping in and out of some slides today. So winning with generative AI in 2024. Let's begin with a poll question just to start things off. Curious, I think this will help shape some of the discussion today. My organization is experimenting with generative AI at the appropriate pace. You can define what the appropriate pace is, but curious about where you would rate your organization. Do you strongly disagree or strongly agree with that comment, or somewhere in between?
And actually, yeah, Scott's just resetting the poll, so you should see it now. Poll question: pace of adoption. So please weigh in there. And again, we're specifically mentioning generative AI here. So obviously, AI is a very broad term about machine intelligence, and I think specifically it's creating new content, data, from data sets that didn't exist. So we'll focus specifically on that. But keep the responses coming. Want to get a little bit more to hear from you, because of course, this is a key consideration given how fast the space is moving. So let's take about 5 more seconds. If you haven't responded, please do. Just a couple more. Thank you. 1 or 2 more. Awesome. Great. Scott, do you want to end the poll? Let's take a look at the results.
It's a pretty even breakdown, actually. This is interesting to see. I'm curious a lot. I think that word, the appropriate pace, that's doing a lot of work in that sentence, because we've all got different opinions about what the appropriate pace is right now. For some, that might be to be pretty reserved and cautious. For others, it might be full steam ahead. Pretty broad range. In fact, if you look at it, we're probably pretty evenly split between agree with that and disagree with that and folks in the middle. So that's super helpful. Interesting to see. The goal today is to provide some tips so that wherever your organization is on this and however you define appropriate pace, you'll have some tools and some ways to think about how to get to the appropriate pace when it comes to using generative AI. What we're going to do is we're going to start off with the good old OODA loop. Many of you are probably familiar with this in the background, developed by an Air Force colonel years ago as a way to help troops in combat to assess a situation when there's a lot of ambiguity and make decisions when you don't have access to all the information you need. AI isn't combat, but it's a pretty ambiguous situation. The future is uncertain when it comes to AI, and so I think it's helpful to have a framework for understanding what to do about it. And we're going to use this OODA framework to walk through some ways that large organizations can figure out what to do about generative AI. First, I think it might be helpful to begin with a definition of what generative AI. We're going to talk about what it means to observe and orient and to get aligned as a leadership team around what the opportunities and threats are related to generative AI. Generative AI, in my view, is simply AI that's capable of creating text, images, new content. Large language models, you've all heard a lot about and probably experimented with, are a form of generative AI. Not all generative AI is a large language model, but we think about generative AI as AI that can produce new text, images, or other media. It's been around for a long time. It's been in development for a long time. I love the story of Alan Turing, right? He was, maybe you've heard of him, born before World War I, when soldiers went into battle still wielding swords. The guy was born a long time ago and started working on AI pretty early. He was actually initially started, I think this is interesting, began looking at what he called the halting problem. He was trying to figure out if it was possible to program an algorithm that could determine whether another algorithm was going to be capable of solving its operation. It's a really hard thing to do. And introduced this idea that we could program computers at all, and ultimately planted this idea that human ingenuity may not be the rate limiter as to what we might do in scientific discovery. The idea that we can effectively program sand to think, which is what we're doing, is crazy when you think about it. We're taking rocks, we're programming those rocks to think. That is a really interesting idea. Turing came up with this idea of the imitation game, where you could, in theory, program a computer to imitate a person to the point where that computer was so good a person couldn't tell. It became known as the Turing test, and became kind of a benchmark to determine whether we had achieved true or reasonable facsimile of artificial intelligence. Well, that Turing test has been passed almost without very much fanfare, surprisingly. We kind of went through this and like, well, we passed it. Turned out maybe to be easier in some ways than people thought it would be. So here we are after decades and decades of development. Generative AI has popped on the scene recently with some really interesting consumer applications that have sparked a lot of warranted attention. People starting to experiment it using different ways. Generative AI is a classically disruptive technology, and I mean that in the Clayton Christensen sense of the word, meaning that generative AI is something that starts off looking like a toy, takes root in market, moves up market, becomes more sophisticated, makes things that were previously difficult or really expensive accessible and affordable to the masses. What it does is it enables lots of people to have access to capabilities that are highly technical that previously could only be done by experts, things like software coding and other things. So it's going to create massive opportunities. A lot of people worried about generative AI. In my view, I think that worry is not entirely unwarranted, but almost entirely unwarranted. I'm an optimist about these things. There's a great website, highly recommend, pessimistsarchive.org, where they catalog newspaper stories from the past when new technologies came out, and all the pessimists saying how this is going to be so bad for society and humanity. And these are technologies like bicycles and telegraphs and teddy bears. There's a great one on teddy bears, how this was going to ruin children. It's a common human reaction when a new technology comes on to be really worried about it. And we're seeing that right now. When you look at history tells us that we should be optimistic generally about AI. On average, over past in history, the optimists have been right. And as people say all the time, we say all the time here at High Off Innovation, pessimists sound smart, optimists make money. There's a lot of opportunities to make money with generative AI. It feels like magic, the old Arthur C. Clarke quote, that any technology that's been developed well enough will feel like magic, will be indistinguishable from magic. It's still early with generative AI, but it does feel like magic when you use it. And as a result, we should expect AI to get foothold in certain applications and start to move up market, perhaps really quickly, following the path of traditional disruptive innovations. Now, there are some things about generative AI that make it different from traditional disruptive innovations. That includes the fact that it's improving exponentially. It's improving really, really quickly. There's in fact, let me pull this up. There's a great writer, Tim Urban, who pulled this together. It's really hard for our brains to process exponential growth curves, especially when we're in the middle of them. On the right hand is what it feels like we're in the middle of it. You see gradual increases in performance. The reality is things, when they're growing exponentially, start to improve really, really quickly. When you look at AI and its promise, it's growing exponentially because of network effects and because of the technology behind it. Somebody was saying the other day, if you were to assume that in the next year, let's assume that chip performance doubles, that large language models double in their performance, that investment in capacity leads to 10x more capacity in some of these large language models. You're getting into orders of magnitude and improvement in performance, 40x next year, 40x better than it is today, maybe 40x the year after that, 1,000 plus performance improvement in the near term. I don't understand what that even looks like. It's hard for our brains to process what that type of exponential improvement looks like. Long way to say it's coming quickly. And people are making, I think, overly optimistic predictions about what's going to happen too. Famous VC Vinod Khosla was saying the other day that in 25 years, it may not be necessary for people to work in society anymore, at least the societies that adopt generative AI. I think we will still find plenty of ways to keep busy and work. I'm not worried about that. But it is reasonable to think that Elon Musk was saying the other day, generative AI plus robotics will make it so that the things that we buy today will become almost free, very cheap in the future. Another way to say that this technology has the promise to make humanity much wealthier. And I think he may be right. The degree and the timing, we'll see. But if it goes and continues on the curve, it's going to create massive impact, exponential growth. Now, what also makes this technology different is that corporations have advantages. That's not normal when we're dealing with disruptive technologies. And corporations have advantage because corporations have access to unique data sets upon which models can be built to play with generative AI. We're going to talk about what that means and how corporations can take advantage of that. There are also plenty of risks for corporations, especially now in the early days. We'll talk about that as well.
One thing, Elliott, that I'd love to do is, so for everybody, let's put a little bit of a pin in the point Elliott just made. There are folks out there who will say, well, I'm sick of talking about generative AI. We've been talking about it for a year now, and it's not going to be what people say it's going to be, or it's just another emerging technology. I think, provocative or not, let's put a pin in it. We'd love to see in the chat, in Q&A if you disagree. But I think we collectively believe this is different. This isn't sort of metaverse where everybody thinks it's going to be some kind of Ready Player One, and it just isn't. Where other technologies just haven't turned into, borne out the hype. There certainly is a lot of hype here. I think one thing that's different is the way it's democratized. We can all log into ChatGPT and just try it. And so we can get a sense of how just immediately the way it is today, it's beneficial. We're actually able to leverage it versus something that's just theoretical and, in the future. So I think our view, as Elliott's saying, is no, it is here. It's just going to get more impactful in sort of all areas of our lives. I think certainly here in the way corporations pursue growth throughout sort of all the processes, the capabilities that organizations have, innovation, it's going to be pervasive. And so as we go on to the poll question that Elliott will introduce in a second, please put in the chat or Q&A if you disagree. But, I'm not sure if there's a so-called trough of disillusionment here. There might be a little bit of a dip when certain promises go way out there, but it feels like this is different this time. So if you don't disagree in the chat and Q&A, we'll assume you're all on board.
Yeah, on that point, I'd love to know if we've got any techno pessimists in this one who view it as too much hype and think this will fizzle out or not move as quickly as others may think.
And Elliott, maybe this is where we reveal that you're actually an avatar powered by generative AI to blow everybody's minds. But anyway,
yeah, the real me is actually taking a nap. So. Yeah, if only. I did show up to a company. We had a company all hands the other day where we had like 3 bots show up to come take notes. And it's like, okay, we're getting to the point where we'll just all have our bots interact and do the work for us. Maybe be great. Hey. The organization started deploying generative AI. What are the areas of focus? There are different ways to use generative AI. Are you using it to optimize your existing operations, cut costs? Are you using it to improve the experience for your customers? This one I'm really curious about. If anybody out there, the corporation is using generative AI to build whole new business models or other, maybe there's another way you're using it that we hadn't considered. Would love to know how it's being deployed right now. Perhaps none of the above is an option too for those of your organizations who may not be doing this at all yet.
And I think it's real easy to experience the first two. So just playing around with it, it's pretty easy to get a sense of how you can deploy it in that way. It is interesting because, sort of Twitter, now X, based on perhaps what I'm looking at, I get tweets and a feed all the time from people saying, hey, I just launched, my new custom GPT, and look at these 500 applications and look at all these tools. And particularly people going, I just created a startup in 2 hours and I'm already making $100,000 a day or something like that, leveraging the tools. And if you're not a millionaire already leveraging Gen AI, you're dumb, that sort of thing. So clearly there's a lot of hype and spam around that, but at least from there are actually some cases of people who've tried to build new ventures purely using it. We also know in the corporate space, there are some tools out there where you've got some firms trying to help, again, corporate leaders build new growth businesses or ventures leveraging it. So we can stop the poll. We've got a bunch of you who've responded, and we can share the results. Let's see if all of you are using it in ways that we've talked about. Elliott, take it away.
Yeah, this makes sense. So you think about optimizing existing operations, cutting costs. That's where the lowest hanging fruit is, right? This is the easiest way to experiment with generative AI and see what we can do to streamline our operations. Really curious. I'd love to see, we ought to spend it'd be fun just to do a show and tell sometime to see how people are using AI to improve customer experiences and what they're building. And then the other one, the one that I'm most passionate about, what we do at High Alpha Innovation, is building entirely new businesses using generative AI as the base. Great to see the breadth. This probably feels like an appropriate mix. Those of you who are selected other would love to see how you're using it in the chat to optimize an R&D process, internal experimentation. That's great. Great. So it's fantastic to see so many people experimenting with it. The reality is, I think there are a lot of organizations that are, we were just talking about this before the webinar started, a lot of organizations that are pretty wary of generative AI. In fact, have put bans in place. Nobody's allowed to use ChatGPT or other LLMs right now till we figure out what's going on. And the reality is it's happening, whether or not companies want it to happen or not. People experimenting with large language models to get their work done faster and see benefits from it. A lot of interesting studies coming out right now showing, for example, the one I loved a couple months ago, using ChatGPT, putting it head to head with a bunch of Wharton MBAs to see who could come up with better new business ideas, and the ChatGPT won handily. I don't know what that says more about ChatGPT or the Wharton MBAs, but I love that type of thing nonetheless, to just see the advancement, the experimentation. The great quote I read the other day on Twitter, Steven Sinofsky is a former Microsoft exec. If you're an incumbent and believe AI is the next platform shift, the question is not how do you infuse it into every level of the stack, it's how do we build a new stack that starts with AI. This is a big point, and this is true of all disruptive technologies. He says it really well. The biggest mistake is treating disruptive technology as an ingredient. Now, we've talked about, a lot of you are experimenting with this new disruptive technology to figure out ways to integrate it in the existing stack. That's good. That's good, and it's the right thing to do. It's also worth bearing in mind that the end result of that is achievement of table stakes. Everybody's going to be doing that. Everybody's going to be running their operations through generative AI to some degree. Everybody's going to be figuring out ways to optimize their customer experiences through generative AI. The question is, are you going after where the big opportunities and where the big value capture is, which is building entirely new business models around generative AI and entirely new tech stacks? We think about it like this. If you think about where to apply generative AI, we talked about observe and orient around the situation. The next step is then to decide where you're going to deploy generative AI. We think about these categories. You can use it to streamline your operations, to improve your customer experiences, or build entirely new businesses. And you think about it on the left-hand side of this is primarily about cutting costs. On the right-hand side of this is more about transformation and ultimately about growth of the business. Where do you get started? A simple way to get started, I think, as a corporate executive, especially an innovation leader, is to simply look at what you're doing today as a business. It sounds like many of you are, and to ask the question, what would a smarter version of this look like? The reality is, if you're not building that smarter version with generative AI right now, somebody is somewhere. Good chance we might be Alpha Innovation doing that and looking to launch startups to do some of those things right now. The thing is, once you know the answer to the question, what would a smarter version of this look like, an AI-enabled version of what we're doing look like, go out and figure out ways to build it. We'll talk about that in a second, how you actually get started doing it. So the first two columns here are really about integrating generative AI into the existing stack. It's the third column that's about building a whole new stack around that generative AI, like the Steven Sinofsky quote was saying. If you think about this, just to bring this to life, what the differences are between these categories. Think about like a consumer clothing company optimizing operations. You might use generative AI to put in place inventory controls or planning around your ordering. Improving the customer experience might be using AI to create a virtual dressing room experience for your customers, for example. Building new businesses might be using generative AI to enable customers to design and manufacture their own products, right? Whole new set of operations to pull that off with AI at the heart of that new tech stack. So generative AI affords opportunities to corporations to do all three of these things. The first two columns are really useful. The last column is ultimately where a lot of the big opportunity exists. But pursuing that is not without risk right now, especially it is really early. It's worth mentioning that too. Right now, it's important to note that it's easier than ever to get started. We'll talk about running experiments with generative AI in a second. It's easier than ever to get started. It used to be to do anything around AI or machine learning, you had to make sure you first had a really clean data set and the data was structured, and you do all these things to collect the data, clean it up and all that. It's much, much easier now. These models can work with more unstructured data. It can surface hidden data. It doesn't have to be as clean. Now, the reliability of the output goes down, the less confidence you have in the cleanliness of that data. It's important to note. But it's a lot easier to get started than it used to be. But there are a lot of risks for large corporations in doing this. It's still really early days. And this is the reason why your IT department and your company might be trying to put some restrictions around the ability of people to use generative AI in your company right now. Number one, the IP rights is still kind of the Wild West. The data protection, if you're going to put your data into a model, what happens to it? Who owns it? Who owns the output? Who owns the model? Still being sorted out, and there needs to be some care around that. The reality is that the negative effects of generative AI produced by scaled corporations are going to be really conspicuous for a while, and they're going to erode trust in your institution if you're not careful. It's no big deal if a startup puts out hallucinations using their model. It's a very big deal if a large corporation does, because it's noteworthy and it attracts attention. So you need to be concerned about unreliable, inaccurate responses or recommendations coming out of your models, coming out of that generative AI. So the governance challenge around this is really tricky. And if in your organization, you don't already have governance structures and ways to do that around the data that you're managing, it's a lot. That governance, the ability of your organization to govern data is kind of determines just the rate limiter for how quickly you can move with generative AI right now. And so step one might be in that observe and orient part of the OODA loop. It's thinking through how do we actually do the governance around this and making sure everyone is aligned on that. That's not the exciting part of this, but it's a really critical piece for corporations because there is so much risk. We'll talk about ways to work around that in just a second when it comes to experimentation. What do I mean by the governance challenge? You think about these data models, they suck in a bunch of data, they regurgitate it, all the data they're exposed to without sensitivity for accuracy or ownership. Organizations need to think about security and privacy around that stuff really carefully. It's not, this is real stuff. There does need to be some care right now. It is early. And this goes contrary to every fiber of my being to say something like this. My normal path is to say full steam ahead, go run experiments, go play around, see what happens. This is different. There does need to be some care because the errors and are going to be so conspicuous and costly. Also, the data that comes out of these models grows exponentially. So you think about now you've got machine generated data, and how do you store that, structure that? How reliable is it? How do you compare that with other data? Organizations need to really think carefully about the bias in their data and in their models, copyright infringement, security breaches, on and on. So a long way to say governance matters a lot when it comes to experimentation around this. You need to get your governance house in order to do this. organizations need to understand the risk in getting involved deeply in integrating generative AI into their operations or into building new businesses. We'll talk about just a second how you structure experiments to address some of that.
Yeah, and Elliott, I think so. So the first point we emphasized, right, was that it's not going away. This is different, and this is here to stay, and it's already having impacts with generative AI-based tools on how corporations, again, survive, but absolutely grow and lead. So I think the second point we're emphasizing here is sort of the promise and the peril, right? And I think we got two of our friends put some good comments into the chat. Rick Robinson said, LLMs will become commodities. Your proprietary data they rely on will not. How do you make use of your data and protect it from the open AI Hoover? And I think, Elliott, you talked to that absolutely is a risk. And so governance is important, figuring out how to leverage the best of these technologies and LLMs without, again, taking your proprietary data and putting it up into them. And then Braden Kelly, bigger question will not be how we use it, but how the tool providers use it to empower us to achieve more. Interesting point there about Adobe and how they're integrating AI into Photoshop. Whole separate conversation we can have about creativity. What does this mean? There was a drawing I did for my daughters a while ago that I laminated. It was this whole sort of hand-drawn thing. And I took a picture of it. I, just with ChatGPT and the DALL-E integration, I said, hey, create some art based on this. And it created poster-ready, beautiful art, far better than I could ever do in a million years, for no money in 2 seconds. And I just scale up the resolution to make a poster. Great debate. Is that creativity? Was I being creative? Who owns that? All the artists who've got the unique talent, capabilities to make those posters, what happens to them? So, but I think promise and peril, I think those are the 2 points. Elliott, before we move on, again, with those questions in the chat, or at least those mentions about the open AI Hoover and about how it boosts productivity and user experience. Any follow-on comments there?
Yeah, that's good. I'll stop sharing slides here for just a second. I'll pull back up a poll question here in a minute. There's a lot of promise and peril right now. The good news, I think, is that a lot of these answers are getting figured out here pretty quickly. So we've had, just in the last 4 to 6 months, dramatic shifts in the cost of producing large language models, for example. It's gotten infinitely less expensive. I was a few weeks ago at an event where the CEO of a large, well-known AI company it was raised $5.5 billion to build the models of the size they need to be able to produce the breadth of products they hope to produce. Incredibly expensive to get that computing power. The good news is, for most corporations that have unique data sets on which they want to build models, you can now build really small large language models. They're highly accurate, less likely to hallucinate, for almost no cost. And more and more tools are proliferating for doing that, which is really exciting. Just saw a bunch of announcements out of OpenAI last week about that. So it's getting much easier for large corporations to take a data set, put it into a model, build a custom model, and to use it. That's fantastic news. And as that happens, a lot of the questions around the risks of ownership of the data and the output, and how do you warranty the recommendations? How do you mark what we have confidence in, what we don't? These things are being figured out pretty quickly. So anytime anything like this pops up that's new, it feels like, oh my gosh, we're late. Everybody's already figured this out. We're late to the game. It's not late. It's still very, very early in the exponential growth curve here. There's still time to figure stuff out. And if your organization is saying, hey, on some of these things we just don't know yet, and we need to wait. The good news is that a lot of these questions you may have, your organization may be uncertain about it being answered in a matter of months in some cases. And so it's waiting to next quarter to do something, not 5 years from now.
We just got a question in, which I think is a great one to take at this point. And again, to all of you who are submitting questions and putting things in the chat, please keep that going, because we want to make sure we're addressing your points of view and your questions. Is, quote, intelligent the new smart? If we think back to the early days of IoT, and if so, what lessons to take for AI and unintended consequences? Good question. Any thoughts on that mind-expanding question there, Elliott?
I think the difference between intelligent and smart is all a matter of perception. In the matter of the Turing test, right? Is it intelligent? Is it smart? Sometimes it doesn't matter. Is it producing the output that we want and we find helpful? I think a lot of this comes down to the industry you're operating into, and how careful you want to be about the results and relying on them. It's one thing, for example, for a doctor to use the results of generative AI to treat a patient, make decisions about treating a patient, than it is for an email marketing company to determine how they're going to tweak their algorithm. So the field of use and where you're experimenting and the potential risks and the level of harm matters a lot when you're considering just how much can we rely on the output of these models right now.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Let's keep going.
Let's pull up the survey question here. I'm curious about this one, given that conversation and what some of the things we were just talking about. Use of generative AI is officially approved in my organization. Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or always.
Make sure to weigh in here. Let's get at least 75%. Yeah, I'm curious to see where folks are, like, based on what you said, the sort of the imperative to learn about it and be aware of it, but then also the concerns about what happens. And again, as we know, there's been some high profile examples of folks and corporations who've used it and suddenly created great risk for their organizations because of where the data went, policies they ran afoul of. So they were experimenting great, but doing it in a way where the risk was much greater and potentially the fallout from it. Please respond if you haven't already. Let's take another few seconds. Looking for a few more of you to weigh in, and please definitely put some additional context and color in the chat if you want to be. So if you want to, so we can have a sense of what's behind your answers. We can end the poll and let's take a look at where it came out.
Interesting. So a lot of sometimes means a lot of people still operating in the gray zone, trying to figure it out, what is approved and what's not, probably. That's really hard. That's really hard for innovation teams, isn't it? To know where the guardrails are. And what does officially mean? Question in the chat too. That is a good question. We have a policy about it. Yeah, I guess it means if you're operating with, you're playing with the generative AI, your executive team would be fully on board with you doing that, or they'd say, wait, what are you doing? Maybe it's the test. Whether there's a policy or not is a second thing.
It's like the whole thing where they say, like, if what you're doing ends up on the front page of the newspaper, if your grandmother knew about it, like, that's a bit of a test as to whether or not it's a good thing. So it's like, yeah, if others in your organization, if your risk folks, your legal folks, if your, executives knew what you were doing, would they be, attaboy, great work, keep doing it? Or would they, would you have some very uncomfortable conversations? Maybe that's it.
Yeah, Brian, good point. It should be an unknown choice in that poll, where a lot of people just don't know you're acting. I'm not sure if it's a sanction or not. That probably applies to, I would bet, to most instances of people playing around with generative AI. A lot of people in kind of a lot of organizations in a wait and see mode. So let's talk about how to run experiments with generative AI in that context. The quote down here is something we say a lot at High Alpha Innovation. In the face of an unknown future, the best way to maximize returns and minimize risk is to run as many experiments as possible at the lowest possible cost per experiment. Once you're aligned around the opportunities related to generative AI with your organization, you've decided where to implement it, operations, experiences, building new businesses, all the above, some combination. The next thing to do is to act. And the thing around generative AI is there's just so much uncertainty right now. We don't know how things are going to play out. And so the point is organizations need to be in a mode where they can be running lots of experiments and experiments with guardrails, right? Where the organization is not at risk, that risk is being mitigated and managed. What's an experiment? I define an experiment as any action you take where the outcome is unknown. Now, there are unstructured and structured experiments. In the case of generative AI, you want to be running as many cheap, structured experiments as you can. And you need to figure out how can you run more experiments and how can you lower the cost per experiment that we're running. There is no data about the future. We say all the time too, also here on the slide. There's no data about the future. And so you can sit there with your team and the organization and debate about uses of generative AI and how it might be used or not. People have opinions right now. There's not a lot of data. Action creates data when there's ambiguity. And that data creates knowledge. And over time, that knowledge compounds. And so you want to get more compounding knowledge in your organization about what to do. The only solution is to take more action. You've got to take action to generate the data about the future. To figure out what's going to happen and to learn. And we think that the best way to do that is to run a lot of experiments experiments that are fast, cheap, and weird. I was joking with Alex and Scott a second ago before this about putting this on a mug: fast, cheap, and weird. We talk a lot about fast, cheap, and weird experiments at high alpha innovation. So fast meaning you're operating in days, not months. The good news with generative AI is it's getting very easy to run really quick, fast experiments. Cheap, what I mean by that is that the cost per experiment is low, but what it also means is the cost per experiment is capped. We'll talk about ways to do that in a second. And the cost per experiment might even be leveraged. In other words, maybe you can even borrow other people's capital to run some of these experiments. Weird, meaning the experiments should challenge existing beliefs of the organization. An experiment that you run that confirms what the organization already knows is often a waste of time. You want to be generating those experiments that uncover anomalies, surprises the organization, things you didn't think were true. The best experiments lead to more experiments. Is a good way to think about what experiments should we run when it comes to generative AI. Well, one question might be, let's go run the experiments then that help us to generate more experiments that are going to lead us to question what we think is true about our business model, about our customers, about their preferences, about our products. Go run experiments that challenge the status quo. As we've been talking about, the good news with generative AI is that the costs are plummeting. You can build custom large language models right now for very little money, almost nothing or close to free. You can train those LLMs on your proprietary data. Just make sure you understand the ownership rights around that data and the outputs, of course. Those small models that you can build are less prone. We hear a lot about hallucination of large models. The small models are less prone to hallucination than the large models are, which is good news. Those big scaled models are still very, very expensive to create, even if that cost is going down to exponentially. They're still very expensive and prohibitive for most organizations when it comes to running experiments. But the smaller models can be good enough for a lot of applications that you're thinking about, ways you might want to deploy generative AI. So you ought to be finding ways to go do that. Now, given some of the risks that we've highlighted around the challenges around governance and things like that, we believe that for many applications of generative AI right now, the best way to pursue those opportunities is going to be to push them entirely outside of the corporate walls in the form of new independent startups that are doing some of these things where the cost, the risk can be capped and where the learning can be a lot faster. Outside of the governance structures that are optimized for running a scaled organization. Putting these things into outside entities and startups can also be a way to get some of that leverage around other people's capital and expertise that we talked about. And Alex, you looked like you're about to say something. I kept talking.
No, 100%. Just to underscore. So again, the first point was absolutely Gen AI is happening. Obviously tremendous implications for our lives broadly, but certainly, again, how corporations not only optimize processes and improve the customer experience, but for their growth and how it gets deployed. So that was number one. Number two, the promise and the peril, right? So tremendous potential, opportunities unlocked, growth that can get generated, but the potential drawbacks, we said, like the risk, potential fallout through sort of use of these tools that's unsanctioned or without the appropriate governance that's, involved. But I think the third point here, right, is, it's absolutely happening, and it's just going to happen faster. What do they say? The future is happening, just not evenly distributed, or, whatever it is, right? So actually, what does it mean to you and your organization, to you and your applications? We just wrote a piece as InnoLead, beginning to talk through how this is going to impact the practice of innovation and the generation of growth in large organizations. You can apply generative AI across everything from developing strategy and developing a growth strategy and alignment, down to how you put together capabilities, down to how you actually execute any of the tools in the growth portfolio or toolkit. So whether you're making, scouting startups, making investments, you're working with Elliott or others to build startups externally, you're doing internal incubation, right? So it's everywhere within organizations, which has big implications for innovation as a capability and innovation careers and the like. Tremendous implications, though, for consultancies and for software platforms out there that help organizations, for canvases. Our friend Braden, I think, put his in there. Again, if you know what to ask, I was working with somebody just the other day, one of the leaders in our community, and I said, hey, do you could ask a question about jobs to be done and say, frame it as Tony Elworker, Bob Messer, Clay Christensen do in their books. And boom, it explains the framework and then presents it that way, right? So I just sort of say all that because, again, promise and peril. There's both. A lot of uncertainty about where. And so just underscoring Elliott's point that so you've absolutely got to start asking the questions and experimenting to see, regardless of where you are there. And now, again, Elliott, as you'll proceed here around specifically how corporations have to do it, because there's those who will proceed at the pace of generative AI and those leaders and organizations who will govern it way back, which is going to negatively impact their ability to take advantage of it. How do you proceed in a risk mitigated way? So just want to underscore that for everybody. Please also keep questions and comments going in the chat. Elliott, let me hand it back to you to get into some of the venture work.
Yeah, a couple of good questions popped up on the in the Q&A. It might be worth addressing now. Actually, what free, near free, rapid prototyping tools do you recommend? So there are a lot of interesting. It feels like every day there are announcements like this. It's the old quote. Sometimes there are lifetimes that occur in a day. It feels like that around some of the AI tools coming out right now. People were really excited about using Llama out of Meta as a tool for building custom large language models. Because it felt like you had a lot of control, it was relatively inexpensive. OpenAI just released their custom GPT tool I think it was that last week or the week before, where you can now jump in and play pretty quickly and develop your own custom GPTs. Again, you need to be aware about all the implications around data rights and output ownership, model ownership in these things. But interesting to see that development. There are ways to run really quick experiments. The other thing to think about is the second question here, bias in data. And by the way, on that near free rapid prototyping, happy to chat offline about that in more detail. Just shoot me a note, and love to compare experiences. Been playing around with a lot of these too. See how what you're learning, what you're preferring. Bias in data is danger we're hearing about all the time. What are your thoughts on mitigating that risk? Bias in the data is not as much of a danger as is bias in the output from that data. And so I think this is a bigger topic and probably worthy of its own presentation and for just that topic, because it's tricky. The reality is the bias shows up in the recommendations that come out of the model, and that's where you need to be careful testing that against reality. Anyway, it's a tough one to answer. It is one of the ways I think you mitigate a lot of the risk around all of this, as mentioned, is taking these opportunities and running the experiments in the form of startups outside the organization, where that risk is mitigated. The downside risk is capped in terms of capital lost and risk to the large organization. The upside opportunity is not capped. And so that becomes a tool for figuring out how to manage risk in a lot of ways. We think about building new ventures outside a corporation. Often that applies primarily to things that feel more transformative or counter to the strategy or competitive with the core business in some way. The unique thing about AI and where we're at right now is I'd actually suggest for a lot of corporations that moving up the core adjacent transformative spectrum into some of those more adjacent even opportunities might be a better fit for outside ventures, again, because of some of the risks at this stage that need to be managed and the learning that needs to happen really rapidly. Keep the questions coming. We'll come back to some more Q&A here in a second, but I wanted to run through just a couple of examples of how corporations are doing this, and this is from our own portfolio. There's some amazing examples out there, by the way, of experiments that corporations are running around generative AI and what they're doing. It's so fun to see the creativity and what different people are doing, and how importantly, how they're doing it, how they're structuring those experiments. For us, we're partnering right now with corporations to build new independent startups using AI, not a lot of generative AI yet, to be clear, using AI with a path to this becoming more generative over time. Alpine's a great example here. Alpine Health is a company we launched with a health system based in Illinois, OSF. What Alpine is doing is taking a unique data set that the health system has and turning that into a decision-making tool that other health systems can also benefit. So here's what we did. Alpine, the health system has a problem like many health systems with what they call complex discharges, which is patients who come into the health system, get healed, made better, thankfully, in the hospital, ready for discharge, and there's nowhere to send them on to. Maybe they don't have a family to pick them up, a home to live in. There's not a rehab facility to send them to. they end up staying in the hospital for a long time. And every health system deals with this challenge, creates enormous costs because they're gone beyond the period at which the hospital can bill for their care. And it's a massive problem for health systems all over the country. What Alpine does is it takes the data, historic data for that health system, any health system around their complex discharges, and creates a model to predict when someone shows up at the hospital, when they check in, how likely are they to be a complex discharge. Those patients are flagged, and people can start working immediately as soon as they enter the hospital on how the discharge is going to work, creating a better experience for the patient, saving money for the hospital, and creating better care outcomes for those patients as well. 86%, I think, is the number, their predictability of patients who are going to face that based on the math. Now, right now, that's more traditional AI. Machine learning is the first version of that experiment. Over time, it's easy to imagine how generative AI might also play a role in actually creating the discharge plans and coordinating the communication around that. So it's a good example of how a corporation's using a unique data set to do something. Now, for them, it is optimizing their operations, conserving cost, but they're using that and saying, you know what, other people have this problem too, creating an entirely new business model based around that AI to go solve the problem for others and generate more value that way. StealthCo is another one. We're calling it StealthCo on here because the company hasn't publicly announced. We launched it a few weeks ago. It's a business we launched with a large pharmaceutical company. Many of you, if you watch any TV at all, you're bored to tears with all the pharmaceutical ads that come on TV. The reason those ads are so anodyne is that they pass through layers and layers, sometimes dozens of rounds of legal and regulatory review before they're published. And those reviews look at everything from fonts to colors to images to the text that is used, the content, for good reason. There's a lot of risk. Any infraction can create massive penalties and pain for the pharmaceutical companies putting out that advertising. But it's an enormous cost to go through and do this. And you start to see where this goes. We launched a company that's building a model to take historic data around marketing that has been approved through those rounds of human regulatory and legal approval to define boundaries and to produce critiques for people as they produce new advertising using AI to say, hey, change to this, you can't say that word, adjust this font over here to make it more likely to pass rounds of review, to shrink maybe 30 rounds of legal review down to 3 or 4, and save cost dramatically in the process. For one pharma company we've talked to has the potential to reduce their operating costs by as much as pretty close to $100 million a year. It's a big, big deal. Now, it's also easy to see that company's beginning with a pretty standard machine learning AI model, but the goal is to get to a point where generative AI is playing a role in actually creating the content that fits within the regulatory and legal bounds. That becomes more important in a world where marketing content is more customized, it's more real time, it's more interactive than ever before, and will enable the companies that use the tool to do that in the future. So early days, but a couple of examples of experiments. Again, with that pharma company is another example where they had a pain point, wanted to fix some of their operational inefficiency using AI, put it out in the form of an independent startup to take on and kind of cap the risk and the cost and to move faster. Over time, that is a thing that other people have a problem with and can benefit from using as well. It becomes a tool to generate value for the organization while solving the problem and learning a whole bunch along the way. So a couple of examples here from our portfolio of new ventures we're building that are relying on AI with corporations to build new business models while addressing some of their operational challenges.
Yeah, and a key related consideration is if you're a leader who's identifying opportunities to deploy, say, generative AI within your walls, as we discussed, to optimize how the business performs, to focus on operations, but also to improve the customer experience. It's so important. And sometimes this is largely only possible with an outside party, like a third partner, a consultancy, or somebody like Elliott, to go, well, wait a minute, if we can deploy it in this way to improve our operations and or improve the experience for our customers, maybe we could actually build this as something we sell to others. And that sometimes is a tough gear or not an easy gear to shift into. But quite often, if you're deploying a new solution to improve your business this way, there's going to be others, and you might say, hey, wait a minute, let's just do this for others in the industry, and boom, you've got a new business that you're incubating internally, or you're working with a venture studio to build. So I think that that's something that's really important to think about. As we get into the wrap up, I just wanted to put in the chat, so in a couple of weeks, Elliott and I are going to have an Ask Us Anything call. So Elliott's going to wrap up. Please put more questions and comments into the chat and the Q&A, because let's address them in the few minutes we have left. But please also sign up for this. Again, it's a Zoom meeting. Everybody's going to be up on screen, and it's really for all of you. So you can get a chance to ask your questions. You can, of course, email Elliott and everything, after this webcast. But it's an opportunity for us to converse directly with you about all these things. So please add it if you are interested. Elliott, let me hand it to you to sort of put a bow on it.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, please do join for that Q&A. It'll be fun. Open topics, and see what we're all learning together about these things. One thing just to clarify on these independent startups that we're building, this is an important note. For the corporations involved, we talk about the importance of capping the downside risk, mitigating that risk, and maybe leveraging other people's capital and experience. We are launching these as venture backable startups, where the corporations are minority owners in the startups, so that those things can move really quickly. And that risk overall is mitigated for the corporation involved. It also provides the opportunity for other venture investors with deep experience in these categories to come in with their capital expertise, help boost these things. It also enables us to recruit world-class founders to run these ventures who are experts at building, scaling, and exiting startups, capturing a lot of value. So really critical. You think about the kind of the trade-offs. Not every idea fits that approach, by the way, but a lot of these ideas that are leading to generative AI, or they're built on generative AI right now, do lend themselves to that approach. It's a way, again, to cap your downside risk, to not cap your upside opportunity, and to get others help along the way. So to summarize, what are the three things to do with generative AI in 2024? The main things here are your organization needs to observe and orient. You've got to understand and align around what is the opportunity, what's the set of opportunity and the threats around generative AI to the organization right now. We're working with a lot of large corporations on that question right now, just trying to sort through what are the implications to the business, where do the opportunities exist to go build new things. Number two, once you figure that out, is to then decide as an organization, what are we going to do? Or how are we going to use generative AI to improve our operations, enhance customer experiences, and ultimately, where most of the value is going to be captured is in building new businesses. Again, generative AI becomes table stakes around operations and experiences. Everybody's going to be doing that in the next few years. Where the real opportunity is to do new things is to build entirely new businesses with generative AI at the heart of the stack. And then finally, it's act. Action creates data. Data creates knowledge. Knowledge compounds. You've got to take action. You've got to go run fast, cheap, and weird experiments, as many as you can. And now is the time to be doing it. Even if your organization is still sorting through the implications and the risk, there are ways you can be running fast, cheap, and weird experiments within those boundaries. And you need to be doing it as an organization right now.
I'll also just, again, point to the understand and align, which is huge. And again, we know it's challenging with innovation. You say the word innovation in a room of 10 people, and 10 people think 10 different things. You're in big trouble at that point, right? Because we need more innovation, we need growth, and you say innovation, and people are thinking all things. Generative AI, what is AI? What is generative AI, right? The understanding is so scattered, right? So heterogeneous. Some people have a sense, some people have no sense, some people think they know a lot, all sorts of things, right? So establishing the common language and understanding, like Elliott says, is crucial. But then through this whole process, the change management piece is absolutely nuts, right? Because you're then going to do things leveraging tools and technologies that maybe a lot of folks within your organization, particularly leaders, may not be aware of, may not have, or be remotely aware of, may not have used, may not understand. And now if you're bringing to them growth opportunities, we have this new opportunity that came out of the tools, or we're building this, it gets even harder, particularly because you don't have a team. It says, oh, and here's the team that did the research and built this thing. So think about that, understand and align all the way through the process. And the change management piece, right, Ellie, is huge. And I think a lot of that slows down organic incubation efforts here. And that's why, hey, become an investor, build a startup, let it move at the pace it needs to. Obviously, you've got to manage the interface with the organization as an investor, but you keep yourself away from some of those really thorny, well, what the heck is this and why are we doing it things, which I think conversations which pop up all the time when you're doing it internally.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So a couple other good questions that came through, by the way. We've got just a couple minutes here. Question from Scott Kirshner, I think. Aside from ChatGPT, what is worth experimenting with or understanding right now from a tool perspective? There's so many. And what I'd recommend, there's a difference between what you might do at an individual level as a free agent on your own time versus what your organization might do. At an individual level, you ought to be playing with as many of these tools as you can just to get a sense for what they can do. ChatGPT is just a start, but go play with Midjourney and DALL-E. Go play with other large language models out there. Compare and contrast the difference between the offerings from Google and Meta and all these other companies to see how they're different. Get on, read some of the threads online, differences of opinion about the pros and cons of the different approaches these companies are taking as a way to get familiar. As an organization, what I'd urge you is there are a lot of ways to go create very inexpensive, relatively small scale large language models as a way to experiment with what the outputs for that could look like. And you can do that in pretty safe ways using Llama, using custom GPT. Again, just being aware of some of the rights ownership around the inputs and the outputs of that, and just being careful. But there are ways to go run some of these experiments really within minutes to go build custom large language models and see what they can do. Again, as a way for the organization to start to learn. Another question that came in: what generative AI impacts are you seeing with consulting orgs who are built on people knowledge? Here comes everyone in the famous words of Clay Shirky, right? Disruptive technology by its nature is empowering to the masses and enables people to do things that were previously very expensive or technically challenging. And I would classify some of the things that McKinsey, Accenture, and others do as fitting those categories: technically challenging and prohibitively expensive for a lot of organizations. These tools will enable people to do a lot of those things that previously people had to pay a lot of money to do from others. So it's coming.
You know, Elliott, with our shared experience in the consulting world, we could totally easily do a whole hour just on this and its implications. And we may end up derailing our Ask Us Anything based on this, but it certainly is an important, question to raise. Because again, there's a lot of things that are not so safe, particularly when you know how to interact with the language models and ask the right questions. Elliott, if you want to maybe wrap up with a final thought, and then we can wrap for today.
Yeah, final thought is my contact information is here. There's a lot of promise in generative AI. Like I said at the beginning, we're all experimenting, we're all learning. There are, what I would say is I'm not an expert in this. Very few people are right now. There's still a lot to go figure out. And there's a lot of opportunity for you to carve out that, to be the expert in your organization, be the one who's learning kind of at the forefront of this. Let's learn together. So feel free to reach out if you've got questions. Happy to chat. Of course, we've got the Ask Us Anything coming up later this month, where I'd love to reconnect.
Yeah, and ultimately just ask questions, right? It's all about asking questions to learn, like Elliott has said. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. Elliott, such a pleasure as always. Thank you so much to all of you who've joined us. So wonderful to have you here with us. Thank you for sharing thoughts in the chat and questions. We will certainly follow up with the replay and some more information. We do have the Ask Us Anything. So we'd love to have as many of you join as possible so we can talk about these things live. And as Elliott said, please don't hesitate to reach out to him or certainly us at InnoLead if we can provide any additional insights. Thank you all so much. Elliott, great to see you, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your weeks.